I would like Jeff, who's so knowledgeable about what's happening in unions today. I'd like you to start it off by telling us something about yourself and your background and where the labor movement is going.
I'm a union electrician by trade. I'm a labor educator by profession, and I am a radical trade unionist by conviction. I work at Cornell University and direct a program there that provides training and education and research and technical assistance to union leaders all across North America. And I was thinking a little bit about what kind of conversation we want to have about this film, which is so incredibly powerful. And one of the feelings I had in watching it again just now was the fear that folks could look at this, an audience could watch this film and think, wow, this is a really amazing story back then. A nice piece of history, but how relevant is it? And what I felt through the film, frankly, is how timeless the recurring question of which side are you on is, and the irrepressible spirit of workers to stand up and fight back against oppression, which I think is also timeless. The workers who were struggling for union recognition in this fight were exercising a right that private sector workers won in the 1930s during the New Deal, which bestowed upon private sector workers the legal right to organize and engage in collective bargaining. And the law that provided for that right, the National Labor Relations Act, says in its preamble that the reason why we should promote the practice of collective bargaining as policy, and that's what it says, it's not that the government should remain neutral on this question, was that there was a recognition at the time in 1935, in the middle of a depression, that employers were very well organized and workers were not. And as a consequence, that disparity in bargaining meant that wages were depressed because workers didn't have the power of organization. And so the reason why this legal right was extended to workers in the private sector in the first place was to give workers an opportunity to organize, engage in collective bargaining, and win a larger share of the wealth that they produce. And what's really interesting, if you track the level of unionization in our economy from that period through the strike to today, there's an important story that I think is told. And I think we need to think about it when we think about the strike, because what those strikers were fighting for were not just the rights of those workers, but rights for workers throughout the economy to engage in a process that's essential to a functioning economy and essential to a democratic society. As the level of unionization rose, it wasn't just union members who benefited from collective bargaining and union representation. But when 1 in 3 workers in the economy were represented by unions, it meant that non-union employers were impelled to raise their wages for 2 essential reasons. 1, to prevent workers from unionizing, and 2, to attract and retain workers who would go to a unionized company if they didn't unionize. So what we really experienced in this economy through the 30s, through the Second World War, and especially into the 1950s, was a classic case of a rising tide raising all ships in the harbor. What happened in the 70s, and that's why this is an amazing moment in American history, is that the level of unionization began to level off. Employers began to resist the efforts of workers to exercise their legal right to organize. And as the level of unionization declined, workers' wages began to stagnate. And what that means essentially is, since the time of this strike, working Americans have essentially had a flat line when it came to their standard of living. So there's no way, I think, to really understand what's happened in Madison and what's happening across the country without putting into that context of kind of the development of private sector versus public sector unionism, et cetera. And it's really interesting that this strike sort of takes place at this critical moment of transition in the American labor movement.
I'm just very curious what the future for unionism is.
It's always dangerous to predict. But I don't think that anyone would have predicted the enormous response on the part of working people in Wisconsin. And these are not just union members, and they're not just public sector union members, but across the board, students, parents, non-union workers, private sector workers, unionized workers, non-union workers, who responded to this attack on the part of Scott Walker, the recently elected governor of Wisconsin, to a clear attack on the fundamental right to engage in collective bargaining. And I think that the response kind of brings to mind this irrepressible spirit that you see in this film of workers who at some core level recognize that there are fundamental rights worth fighting for. And I think that the response there was quite unpredictable. So I'm an optimist by nature, but I think that the response in Wisconsin indicates that working people on some fundamental level understand that they're getting the raw end of the deal, and the only way, as John L. Lewis said in this film, John L. Lewis was the president of the mine workers in the 1930s and one of the key leaders in the organization that took place, who said, without organization, you have no power. And I think, frankly, working people in this country increasingly believe and recognize that they're living every day with more insecurity and less justice, and the only way to rectify that problem is through organization. Now, to me, it's an open question as to whether or not the labor union, as it is currently constituted, is capable of responding to those aspirations in a way that will enable workers to organize and then for the labor movement to get revitalized. But I think it's entirely possible, and I'm really heartened by the response that we've seen in Wisconsin and across the country.
As I look back on this film, and I haven't seen it in a long time, I just thought about how this shaped me. And also to see that these workers were willing to give up their lives for what they believed in. And that's, at a young age for me, just stayed with me and let me realize that in my life that I was going to take risks and I was going to do things. And if I needed to look back, I'd look back at this film and see who my mentors were. So it was a very important period for me in my life. And since then, I've done a lot of other union films as well as other films, but that core and that passion and those people willing to speak out for what they believed in are the things that carry me through my life. Would anybody like to ask a question?
Question in the back?
Well, I guess I started filming in 1972-73. So that was when I began, and I ended in 1976, and I got all the Jablonski material from going through the coal fields and looking in, their archives or their basements, and I just went off with boxes and boxes of material that I was able to tell the Jablonski story. And was I scared? Sometimes I was scared. Sometimes I was very feisty. But other times when everybody had the guns that day, I was very scared. I could feel juices in my mouth, and knowing that these organizers that I so looked up to were scared too made it, a little more terrifying. But what was so beautiful was the women and their strength and how they just cut through everything by singing "We Shall Not Be Moved," and they had no fear whatsoever. So there were times, but most of the time I wasn't. I mean, I learned how to shoot guns, .357 Magnums. We lived with miners, and in their homes at night, we'd put mattresses on the floor because they'd shoot up the homes. And it seems really weird now that we're about to finish a film for HBO called Gunfight, Guns in America, and sort of the American culture of guns. I didn't sort of put the two together, but that's the film we're currently finishing.
Thank you very much for coming. Thanks especially to Barbara and Jeff.